Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Intercooler podcast, episode 234, with Dan Prosser and Andrew Frankel. We're talking about the 911 Turbo this week. Turbos. Okay, fine. This is one of the Icons episodes that we're going to do. So the first one we did was the Mazda MX-5 a few weeks ago. Yeah. Now we're turning things up a notch with the 911 Turbo. Yeah. Before we get started, though, I'm just going to trot through my weekly reminder that podcast listeners can subscribe to the Intercooler's online magazine on website and app for 15% off. If you go to the subscribe page and use the coupon code POD15, you'll automatically get a 15% discount. Yeah. It's the best way to support the podcast. If you like what we do with the show and you want to support it, you want us to do more, that's the way to support us. And of course, you also get full and unlimited access to the multi-award-winning ad-free car magazine that we've been publishing for almost 4 years.
It's one of those great arrangements, we hope, where everybody wins.
It does sound that way, doesn't it?
We win because it means we keep on getting to do stuff like this, which we really enjoy. And you win, we hope, because you will discover something out there which is not replicated anywhere else in the business. An app and a website where every single day, one of the finest writers, be they a journalist or a designer or a driver or an engineer, writes bespoke content just for us. We've already got 1,200 stories up there.
Yeah, a couple of million words.
Adding to it every single working day. And then you help us do this, and hopefully you have a lot of fun on the back of it. Yeah. So, please, if you can, it'd be great.
It makes a huge difference. It really does. Lots of you have done so already, so thank you to everyone. But keep going. Okay, let's get started then. 911 Turbos. Yeah. So this is the right time to do this.
Yes,
okay?
But it's also a podcast. It's going to be a 911 podcast. Yeah. Where I think there'll be some people who know us, who listen to this all the time, and will be thinking, here comes an hour of just unalloyed 911. But it's not going to be like that.
That's the thing about the 911. In our line of work, we drive a lot of 911s because, well, they've been in production for more than 60 years.
Yeah, but they're the benchmark. They're the default setting, aren't they?
There are 1,000 different variants, it seems. But also, a big factor here that people overlook is that the cars are made very available to people like us. Yeah. Compared to, for instance, a Ferrari. Yeah. You can just go and borrow a 911 or they'll send it to you so readily. Yeah. But they also do the numbers, don't they? They always do the numbers in terms of audience stats. So we do find ourselves talking about them fairly often, and often in quite glowing terms, because by and large they're good, right? That's not news to anyone.
I mean, no, it's not news to anybody. They are the benchmark. They are the standard setter. They are the car. If you're a car manufacturer and you make a certain sort of car, that's what you're going to be benchmarking. That's that's what you're up against. And it would be, some people do say, and I completely understand it, that we spend too much time talking about 911s. But every time we do, because we see the data, we know how popular those stories are. I mean, we did a video where we had 3 manual 2-seat rear drive 911s. We had a GTS, we had a T, and we had a GT3. And we did a video, we did a story. And that was one of the most successful things that we've ever done. So I don't apologize for talking about 911s, but I do think it's interesting that we're going to be talking about a breed of 911s, which, while I think absolutely merits the term of icon, and certainly in the automotive sense, is not a car about which both of us feel, absolutely unadulteratedly rosy things about.
Quite right. We're going to get onto that. Yeah. But now's the right time to do it, because the first 911 Turbo arrived in 1974, 50 years ago.
Sort of.
Oh, crikey, okay. It's never as straightforward as I want it to be.
September 73, Frankfurt Motor Show. I think they called it a turbo concept study or something.
Okay.
But it was there on the stand, and if you look at it, you'll go, that's a 911 Turbo.
Right, but the production car was the year after.
Actually, I'm not even sure they delivered any cars till 75. They showed the finished production car in 74.
Okay, fair enough.
And that's why they're taking the date.
So we can call it 50 years.
Yeah, of course.
And now's the time to do it because, well, we had a 911 Turbo S, the current, just about, I suppose it's the outgoing one now, isn't it?
Well, you can't buy it anymore, apart from the 50 years.
There you go.
The £200,000 special edition, 50 years, whatever, which is a Turbo S with some bits on it. Yeah, none of which make the car better to drive.
No, it's stickers
or worse, or anything.
Stickers, badges, and trim.
Exactly.
It's one of those jobs. But we had 911 Turbo S in our most recent group test. Yeah. So we can discuss that a little bit. But also, you a couple of months ago, in California, you drove the 50 years 911 Turbo S, so the latest one. Yeah. with an original.
And one of the very earliest. It was so old. This is a bit of true geekery. It didn't have a boost gauge.
Ooh.
Okay, so the thinking being, okay, that when they first made that car, the truth is that the vast majority of the time, the car was giving negative performance relative to a standard car.
Oh, and you'd know if there's a boost gauge.
If there's a boost gauge, you'd actually realise how rarely you're actually getting more performance than you get out of a whatever it would have been. It wouldn't have even been an SC then. It would have just been like a Carrera. And so they didn't put a boost gauge in it. And then everybody said, we want a boost gauge. And so I think in 77 they started putting boost gauges in them. But no, so this was, I can't remember exactly, but it was certainly in the first 100 production car, 911 Turbo. So yeah, it really was the first and last that I drove.
So the first was the 930. This is the sort of model designation, isn't it?
Exactly, yes.
256 horsepower, thereabouts?
260, but that might be a PS rating.
Yeah. I think that's right.
Yeah.
And a little bit later on, bigger engine, 3.3 litre, and a bit more power.
It was going to have, oh God, that's so sad. I don't know why I remember this stuff. Anyway, it was going to have more power. Originally, it was going to have like 280, 290. The engine was easily capable of it. But Porsche thought it would scare the customers away, and so they went for a slightly more user-friendly 260, which they thought would probably be enough to be going on with.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I agree. So, and up to around 300 horsepower a little bit later on with the 3.3.
Exactly 300. Yeah.
Okay. So, but the 930, was it a 4-speed box?
And
there's a reason for it, isn't there?
Yeah, there absolutely was a reason for it. I mean, simply the car had more torque than the 5-speed box. Could take. Bear in mind that all 911s, I think perhaps apart from the 911T, need to check that, the original 911T, the 1967 poverty spec 911, had 5-speed boxes, and so here was one with 4. And of course, what Porsche said was, "Yes, this car's so fast. It's got so much torque. It doesn't need 5 gears."
It only needs 4. Yeah.
The truth is that it would have melted the 5-speed. They didn't have the budget to re-engineer a brand new gearbox. So they just had to beef up the gears they already had. And once they'd done that, there was only space for 4 of them in there.
That's why.
Yeah.
So the thing about the 930 that I haven't quite understood is what kind of car did Porsche set out to build with it? Were they trying to build a pure road racer? Or were they trying to build a sort of a more luxurious express? What kind of car was it supposed to be? Exactly
the latter. And I think that is one of the most misunderstood things about the early 911 turbos, were that there were these they were the sort of cars that inspired the GT3s or whatever. They weren't like that at all. And if you think about it, if you think about the characteristics of turbocharged engines, they tend to be, in fact, they are quieter than naturally aspirated engines. They don't rev so high. They don't have whip-crack throttle response. So all these characteristics pointed the car in a certain direction. And Porsche wanted a way of extending the 911's life. Don't forget that even by the time this car kind of went on sale properly in 1975, the car was already over 10 years old. So it was already a very mature product in the marketplace. Their cars from Ferrari and Aston Martin and Lamborghini were providing a level of performance no Porsche could match. And so they felt a need to do something. Also, you have to remember the context, which was they'd never been able to do the car if they hadn't gone racing with turbocharged engines in North America in 1971, 72, and 73 with the 917. Can-Am. Those 1,000 horsepower, more than 1,000 horsepower, 1,100 horsepower monsters, which were really incredibly crude to begin with, and then over the course of a couple of seasons got refined, were really the key to it. It was that understanding, that knowledge that allowed them to refine the art of turbocharging to a point where it became viable in a road car. Now, we should also say that it wasn't the first turbocharged road car. BMW had just, by a matter of weeks, I think, beaten them to it with a 2002 turbo, but that car was a complete failure. There was also the Oldsmobile Cutlass Jetfire, the Chevrolet Corvair of the early 1960s, which had turbo engines. They were complete failures too. So it's like people saying, "Oh, I don't know, the Boeing 707 was the first commercial jetliner. It wasn't. The Comet was, but it was the first successful one. And that's what people tend to remember in the same way they seem to remember that the Range Rover was the first luxury off-roader. It wasn't. But that's the one that, set the pace and everybody else. And, so if you think of turbocharged cars, the first properly successful turbocharged, and by successful I mean good enough to warrant being replaced, was the 911 Turbo. So it was absolutely groundbreaking. And back to your point, it was designed to be a luxurious, in those days businessman, these days business person's express. And when you drive one, that's very much how it feels.
So properly upholstered, comfortable seats. Yeah. Quiet, refined, but not without its issues. Well, these cars have a rep, don't they?
Yeah.
For being a handful.
Yeah.
And is that true?
Yeah, completely.
Has it been sort of nullified to some extent by modern tyre technology?
I wasn't throwing Porsche's extremely expensive. I did do it years ago. The first 930 Turbo I drove after having, I was old enough to have driven them when they were still being made. But I think Mark Sumpter at Paragon lent me once for a job I was doing for GT Porsche, and I threw that around, and that would have been on pretty modern tyres. And what they tend to do is they tend to just push the natural behaviour of the car a little bit further away. But if you go looking for it, you'll still find it. It's still there.
The fundamentals are still the same, aren't they?
Yeah, and and if you think about a car with a fundamentally fairly challenging design layout, with the engine slung over the back axle, which we've talked about many times before, and then you add to it a lot more power, a lot more torque, a lot more weight over that rear axle, and then really rubbish throttle response. You can see where you're going to go with this. It wouldn't have been a great surprise to anyone. And so what Porsche did was they pushed out the rear track to give it more rear grip. And what that actually meant was more understeer. And then when the back did go, you were just going that much faster. So it was therefore that much more difficult to catch.
So that's where those wide hips came from.
That's where the wide hips came from. Yeah, exactly. A desire that car would not under any circumstances oversteer. But of course, wet roads, whatever, people trying too hard, it did happen.
Yeah, well.
And if you were really, really good, and you knew how to drive a 911, as in keep your foot in, then, you could, I guess some people could hang on to it. But it's not a condition that you would naturally choose to want to find yourself in, I wouldn't have said.
So in 2024, the Porsche Museum lends you what I guess is an immaculate, very early 911 Turbo.
Yeah, it was pretty good. In fact, on the trip I was on, it was driven from LA to San Francisco, but they had only just got it. I'm not sure they'd even had time to go all the way through it because they didn't have one. But the car was, I guess it's a testament to just how well designed those cars were. As far as I'm aware, and I drove it for a bit on that route. It didn't give anybody any problems at all. Okay,
but clearly a car like that, you're not going to grab it by the scruff and take liberties with it the way you would a modern car because it's precious and you don't want to be that guy.
Yeah. And we're also on busy roads in California and the environment wasn't suited to it.
But given all of that, is there still fun to be had in this car? Is there still a proper driving experience? Or is
goodness, yes, it's a proper driving experience. Yeah. I mean, you're in a 1970s 911, and there is a sense of occasion that comes with that, regardless of what you're in. You're aware that you're in something very special because it was the start of a completely new form of motoring, really, and being in a very early car and knowing that it belongs to the museum. So yes, actually, just the thing about being in it is it's a wonderful place to be. And you think about all the history and you look at the gauges and you look down at those 4 speeds and just try to understand why the car is the way that it is. There's a lot of fun. But what it isn't, it's not sort of belly laugh, aren't we having a laugh?
Yeah, so there are other 911s from that era that you'd far rather drive.
Oh, a 2.7 RS is a completely, it's an earlier car. And in terms of driving pleasure, the way you and I would recognise it, I mean, they're not even in the same postcode. No, a 2.7 RS is a sublime thing that you really want to drive hard. You want to push, you want to slide around, and and you can because it's light, because it doesn't have too much. It isn't fundamentally imbalanced front to rear. It's got incredible throttle response. All the things that the turbo doesn't have. And it was designed for it. It's an homologation special. They knew what they were doing. Whereas the 911 Turbo was designed for a completely different purpose.
What's interesting, so we know, and we'll come to this, but the technology underpinning the car changed quite significantly in the mid-90s and continued to evolve from there.
Absolutely.
But actually the principle was laid down by the 930, wasn't it? More luxurious car.
Yeah.
And actually, consequently, less of a sort of driver's machine.
Yeah.
And it still applies, doesn't it?
As we found out the other day when we had the Turbo S out with the Vantage and with the McLaren Artura. I mean, I think it does show that Porsche is very, very, I would say probably better than any other manufacturer at remembering what it was and how things became the way that they were, and sticking to a successful script. Because you and I may sit here and whinge about the fact that the 911 Turbo is not as good to drive as a 2.7 RS, but actually they'll sell many more 911 Turbos.
Yeah, and the point about the 911 range is that there are different experiences within it.
Of course. And, the 911 Turbo has been such a success, largely because, they sell a lot of them and the margins are wonderful, because they sell, that 50 years Turbo S, so the only 911 Turbo you can buy today, is over twice as expensive. It costs twice as much as a base Carrera. And I would love to know what the parts commonality between the two of them is. It's probably 80%.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. So
they're making money on
this. So there's good business to be done in 911 Turbos, and people like them. You and I might be a bit sniffy about certain versions of them, but that doesn't matter, does it? People out there like them, and they like them for all the right reasons. They like them because they're good at what they're designed to do, and Porsche hasn't forgotten that. And if you drive a Turbo S today, you will find a car that is the true son or great-great-great-great-great-grandson of a 1975 930 Turbo in exactly the same way. It's not going for ultimate handling response, balance on the limit, this, that, or the other. It's going for speed, it's going for refinement, it's going for luxury. Hasn't changed.
That is interesting. What's curious, though, about early 911 Turbos, or that early part of its life, so the first one arrived in, we'll call it 1974.
Yeah.
It was updated during its life with a 3.3-litre engine, but it wasn't until 1990 that the all-new model arrived.
Yes.
The 964.
The other big change which arrived, I think either in 88 or 89, so right at the end, is it got a 5-speed box.
Okay.
It got but only one when Porsche had designed a brand new 5-speed box, the G50. And that could handle the torque. And actually, they're very, very rare and very, very expensive. But if you can find a G50 930 Turbo, they are quite a thing. I always go and look. Look. Every time I see an 911 Turbo, I've got to go and look in the window and see how many positions there are on the gear list. It's really sad, but insight into my world.
There we go.
Yeah.
So the 1990 964,
yes.
It carried over the 3.3-litre engine, didn't it?
Yeah,
with a bit more power.
Yeah.
316 brake horsepower.
Yeah.
Later on, a 3.6 arrived.
Yes.
Big power increase, 355 brake horsepower.
Yeah.
These were still single turbo cars.
Single turbo.
Still rear wheel drive. And what were they like? I mean, presumably, basically same character, trying to do the same thing. But what were they like to drive?
Can I tell you the one thing you need to know about that car, which to me, I mean, it may just be a coincidence. I don't think so. There is one salient fact about that car, which I just find so instructive. Porsche doesn't have one.
Yes. Yeah, there are images of the family tree, the 911 Turbo family tree. They got all the models together, apart from
there's no 964.
The 964. So what does that tell you?
Tells you all you need to know.
Wow.
I was about to say the most scary normal production 911 I've ever driven by a mile. The only other possible rival for that is a GT2 993.
Ooh, so you were a young road tester, I guess, on autocar when 964.
I was in my prime. Stupid enough to try and drive them really fast.
Yeah, so you were a hotshot young road tester, determined to prove how brilliant you were.
Yeah, I did one of the most stupid things I've ever done in a car, one of those. I can probably tell this story now, 30-something years later as it is. When we used to figure cars, record acceleration figures and that sort of thing, we always did it 2-up. because A, that was the test procedure, so you had a reasonable weight in the car. B, you needed someone to operate all the gear while you drove the car. On this particular occasion, I can't remember who it was or why they didn't turn up, but they didn't turn up. I was on my own. And I'd gone all the way to the test track in this thing. This other bloke hadn't turned up, and I just thought, well, I'm going to do it anyway. And you can do it because you can put ballast in the car, so you can put the weight there. What you can't do is operate the gear. And even that is okay, because you put the sensors on the outside of the car and it's all recorded on the computer and it spits out the tape, and that's fine. You can do all that. What you can't do is do a maximum speed run because the gear on the outside of the car creates too much drag and it skews the figures. So you can only do it with a stopwatch, which I had to hold. And so what I did was I thought, well, I'm going to need two hands on the wheel. I was bright enough to realise I was going to need to have two hands on the wheel. So what I did is I drove around the top lane of the Millbrook Bowl at 100 miles an hour, which is what we call the hands-off speed, saw where my hands were on the wheel, and then lashed the stopwatch to the dashboard at that point. So I'd only have to extend a finger to do it. So I thought that was really very clever. So I then headed off and up to, I think it did 174, which is the wildest ride you can imagine in almost anything around there. In that car particularly, by that stage, and what I hadn't bothered to calculate is it had half a turn of understeer on. So not only was the top speed completely meaningless because there was so much tyre scrubbers to make the thing, it also meant my finger was literally nowhere near the stopwatch. But I was so worried about the tyres exploding, I just thought, I've got to get this. So I did do it one-handed at 170, goodness knows what, with the car bucking and kicking in. Looking back at it, it's almost like somebody else was driving that car.
Yeah, it's funny the things we do when we're young.
All to get a completely meaningless figure.
But you don't
but also to be able to tell the story 30 years later.
Yeah, and you don't want to go back to the office without...
I'm terribly sorry. Well, I could have done, actually, because I could have gone back and said, well, Fred didn't turn up.
Yeah, not my problem.
Not my problem. But I guess I would have been the road test editor then. It was kind of and I just couldn't face going back and doing it again. It was such a horrible experience, so I did it. Anyway, yes, so the 964 Turbo was just like the 930 Turbo, really, but much more so. It just had more of everything. More power, more lag, more understeer, more oversteer. It was, if there's such a thing as a 911, I really didn't care for that. It would be that car.
Really?
Yeah.
It's the bad boys' car, isn't it? A 964 Turbo, and there's some affection out there for them because they do look super cool.
Yeah, they look fantastic. They're very rare. 3.6s are really rare. That's the car that I did the Millbrook thing in. And, you'll never feel more alive than when trying to hang on to one of those.
Well, that's something. That is something.
Yeah.
So, we think now of a 911 Turbo as being the ultimate all-weather supercar, don't we? That's its thing.
Yeah.
Four-wheel drive.
Yeah.
All that grip, all that power, all that torque, it puts it all down. And it's quicker across particularly a wet road than anything else on the road. That's what we think of when we picture a 911 Turbo now. And of course, that blueprint was set down by the 993.
Yeah.
1995, because it was the first with four-wheel drive.
Yep.
And it was the first with twin turbos.
That car was, and again, that's interesting because a 993, as you know, is a development of the 964. So you'd think if you're going to make a change that big, you'd wait for an all-new car. But I think Porsche made the 964 and then sort of stood back a bit and went, okay, yeah, probably shouldn't go any further down this road. In fact, probably shouldn't have gone as far down this road as we've already gone. But we have to have a car which has more power and goes faster because that's what people mistake for progression. And so what can we do about this? And so they did two very profound, very different things, which was four-wheel drive and twin turbocharging. And the result was a completely different... No turbo changed more between generations, between 964 and 993, before or since.
Yeah. So the first one, 402 brake horsepower. Turbo S came a bit later on, 444.
Yeah.
So what do you remember of driving those cars back in the day when they were new? And did it feel like the right thing to be doing?
I was a bit disappointed by them.
Really?
Which is silly now because I know... Well, I've driven them since and I love them. But at the time, after the insanity of the 964, it was just so easy. They had proper rear suspension. They didn't try and kill you. They had not half the turbo lag, a tenth of the turbo lag. It had traction. It did not... it was just sort of like... They've made a 911 like everything else. And I can remember that we did a twin test in Italy with that and an F355. Quite a good gig, actually. and the Ferrari walked it because it was so much more engaging and invigorating, and it's what I said earlier about the sense of occasion. But actually, looking back on it, I actually think the 993 Turbo was an incredibly clever car. I think Porsche got it, and if you remember the state that Porsche was in at the time, just how skint they were, just how much trouble the company was in, and I think to come up with a car as pragmatic as that, absolutely the right car for the right time. And when I've driven them since, they just come across as being, I mean, that's actually, we said earlier, didn't we, that the modern 911 Turbo S, you can trace its roots back to the original, but actually that incredible sophistication, that blinding all-season, all-reason cross-country pace, that came with the 993. And I guess if you were looking for the true father of the modern car, it's the 993.
It's that one, isn't it?
And the formula really hasn't changed since then. Mega thing.
And they look fantastic. I've always thought they look really cool, those cars.
With those hollow wheels.
Yeah. Oh, mega. I've never driven one, actually. I'd like to. But, I mean, did they do... Presumably they weren't sort of any more interactive as a machine to drive than the earlier models? I mean, you could clearly lean on them more.
Less so. They were less interactive. The four-wheel drive, it was quite an early four-wheel drive system. There wasn't as much dealing for steering feel. But there's interacting with a car, isn't there? And then there's going into battle against a car.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in the 964, you were definitely in a war, and if you didn't retreat, you were going to lose it.
Yeah, but what we talk about when we say interactive is that sort of harmony where you're working with a car.
Exactly.
And that's when the magic comes.
There was never any sense that the 964 was on your side. There's never any sense the 930 is on your side if you started to push them about. The 993 was absolutely on your side. But I guess it's like all things, it's just not quite as exciting as having something or someone to go up against, if you're all in it together.
So a few years later, I mean, the 911 changed entirely, more than it's ever done.
Yeah.
The base 911 when the 996 arrived.
Yes.
Bigger car, bit lighter actually. New engines, new technology, water-cooled rather than air-cooled.
Yeah.
So the 996 was an all-new 911. And the 996 Turbo arrived right at the end of the 90s. 414 brake horsepower. There was later on an X50 model and a Turbo S with 444 bhp.
Yeah, exactly.
And I still like the look. There was never a fried egg headlight version of the Turbo, the 996 Turbo. Just the one that came later with the slightly sharper headlights. But I always thought they looked cool, and I never particularly like the way the 996 looks. But the Turbo with the width, the stance, the wheels, cool looking thing.
Yeah. But whereas the change in Turbo from 964 to 993 was the biggest change, as I've said, the Turbo ever had, of all the 996s, the least changed was the Turbo in terms of the way that it felt, because it just felt like a more grown-up 993 Turbo. I think the other great point to make, or the very important point to make, is obviously we are now in the era of oil seal failures and bore scores and all those sorts of things that afflicted the 996 and first generation 997 engines. Not the turbos.
No.
They had the Metzger engine, the race engine. And actually, I think today a 996 turbo is really a very, very tempting car.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a bit more durable than the other ones.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's still quick enough. Have you driven one recently?
I can't remember when I last drove one, but certainly within the last 5 or 6 years. I think you would be astonished by how quick they feel. I think you get in one and you think, wow.
Yeah.
Because they've all been upgraded. I think they've all gone up to X50 specification anyway, whether they started that way or not. And yeah, I think you get into that and you get down the road. I don't think for a single second you'd be sitting there thinking, oh God, if only it had another 100 horsepower. Absolutely not. I think you'd be. I mean, this is a car which would easily pull sub 4.
It's enough, isn't it?
It's enough.
That's absolutely enough. And presumably, certainly by today's standards, it still feels slim, which was always the 911 thing, wasn't it? You've got options on the road.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the turbo's less so because they always had, whatever generation, they always had the widest possible bodywork. But yeah, absolutely. So I think, I think it's quite popular to sort of knock the 996. But of all the 996s, you shouldn't be knocking, apart from the GT3 RS. The turbo was, it's probably the turbo which, relative to the other 911s that were around at the time, was the best a turbo has been.
So in that instance, maybe it is the one that you would pick.
In the 996, apart from
GT3,
GT3 and the GT3 RS, I think a turbo is. I mean, just for pure peace of mind, it's ridiculous to talk about the most powerful one as being the one that's most reliable, but it's clearly the case.
That's the way it is.
Of the 996s, absolutely, I'd have a turbo over any other.
So the first 911 turbo that I drove was the 997 that came a little bit later, 2006. 473 brake horsepower, so getting pretty serious now. There was a later version of 493 and then a Turbo S with 523. So massive numbers. Yeah, I remember driving these. I remember borrowing one actually as a sort of cub car journalist. Must have been 21, 22.
Yeah.
Taking it to my uncle's house.
Not a bad thing to be able to do at that age.
Not bad at all. And showing it off, and the whole street came out and taking it down their local test route.
Did it have a 911 hull plate on it?
I think it did, yeah. Pale blue car. You'll recognise it straight away.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and I do you know what? I loved it actually. Still a manual box, which
of course
you haven't been able to get in more recent ones.
Yeah.
And just massive performance. A phenomenal car back then to me as a 21, 22-year-old.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to drive one again, now with a bit more context, much more experience. But do you sort of remember them fondly? Is the 997 Turbo equally sort of up your street as the 996, relatively speaking?
I think it's more so because, the 997, with all the revisions that took place to it, is just a fundamentally better car than a 996, understandably so, and it's reflected in the price paid. And the turbo, I mean, it wasn't okay. Yes, there was more power, there's a little bit more of everything, but it wasn't one of these absolutely landmark changes in the turbo. In fact, the turbo has become almost like a shark. It has actually, now that they settled on the formula, every time there's a new turbo, it'd be interesting to see what happens with the next one, which will obviously have a hybrid drive, and maybe we'll talk about that at the end. But certainly through all the generations, the turbos haven't really changed that much. They have just been, cars that have recognised where they should be and what they should do, and just done that with, just going faster and faster. So no, very much a 997 Turbo is the true child of the 996, and no bad thing for it.
Yeah, I remember the Turbo S that came a bit later, so the 997.2, the second generation 997 Turbo, and up at Anglesey with a couple of rivals, or maybe it was just a V10 Audi R8, and just being astonished by this thing, the performance that it had, the performance that it put down, but also how easy it was to get right on top of that car and hustle it. Yeah, you really could. And they were monster quick. Yeah, around a lap or down a road. Yeah, just phenomenal.
I think that was probably the era where we suddenly started realising that point to point, there wasn't a quicker car you could buy. And I think it's probably still true now. I mean, if you if you were going to go across Wales and the weather forecast was a bit iffy, and without being ridiculous, you just wanted to be able to maintain as much speed as you could in all circumstances. Turbo S.
It's still the one, isn't it? Yeah. And particularly because, I mean, it's fairly banal, fairly prosaic stuff, but they come on moderate tyres in terms of compound and tread pattern. They're not track tyres. No. And so through winter, through wind and rain or whatever else, they're planted still.
Yeah. You try and break traction in one of those, see how you get on. Even in the wet. They just bang,
away
cork
you go.
out a bottle, off you go.
Yeah. Go on.
No, I presume we're going 991 now.
We are. 2013. Yeah. So this is where there's the Turbo and the Turbo S, and there was a facelifted version later on. So power range from 513 all the way up to 572. Yeah. All paddle shift now, PDK. Yeah. A bit bigger than the 997, wider. Yeah. So I went on the original launch of the first 991 Turbo S and Turbo. It was at, that track Bilsterberg in Germany?
Do I?
You may be on this launch. That
I was on it.
Yeah,
I can remember I was stuck in a queue. I probably shouldn't say this, but I won't mention the name. but they were Jethro. I don't know why Jethro and I were in the same car. I can't even remember which one of us was driving. It's not relevant, but we were. You know, it's when you do sort of ducks and drakes and you have to follow the Porsche driver around. Yeah. And we were stopped by someone who couldn't keep up with the Porsche driver on the slowing down lap.
So frustrating.
And we were so angry. We were so angry.
I remember doing that ducks and drakes session, and as long as all the, I don't know if they're ducks or drakes. What are the ones following the lead car?
Well, no, the ducks and the drakes follow the mother duck on the mother.
Oh, fine, okay.
Yeah, we're all ducks and drakes.
Okay, so we're all in the train.
Yes.
And as long as everyone in the train is on it, you can keep up with the lead car, and the lead car goes quicker and quicker.
Yeah.
And it did get quite wild at one point. I remember thinking, okay, I'm pretty much on the limit of what I can do here, especially around that track.
Yeah, which is Bilsterberg. So Bilsterberg is a track where it's got a straight. And it's almost like the person who made it thought, well, that's a bit boring, isn't it? So just where you need to brake for the really tight corner at the end of the straight, we'll put some really big bumps.
Yeah.
Just to make
proper undulations.
Yeah, just to make sure that you never ever and there are places on that track you could have a big accident.
Yeah. It's vertiginous.
So these sessions, for anybody who is interested, Porsche have always done it. Some other manufacturers are starting to do it. Some manufacturers, you go out there and they go, oh, you've got to follow someone around the track, and it's incredibly tedious because clearly the only motivation the manufacturer has is to make sure that nobody sticks their car in the wall. Porsche don't do it like that. They put one of their really serious test drivers or one of their sort of GT3 race drivers in a car that's at least as fast as the one that you're in, i.e. either the same car or a GT3 RS or something. And you follow him round, and you go much faster than you'd ever go on your own because you lean on their braking points and you lean on their turn-in points, and you just do stuff you'd never do without really intimate knowledge of the track. So you go. So the idea is you go a lot faster, but fewer cars end up in the wall. But every time you get back to the pit straight, you all have to swap positions, so everybody gets a chance of following the leader. And it's actually a really good way of evaluating a car absolutely on the limit, reasonably safely, going faster, as I said, than you would normally.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I've done it many times. It is a lot of fun. And actually, during one of these sessions, I witnessed my favourite ever incident of understeer.
There is such a thing?
I loved it. Well, but there certainly is in those cars. If you don't quite manage them properly, because it's a 911, it's very light at the front, they can understeer. You just have to drive around it, and it's easy to do, actually. But I remember at Bilsterberg, the final corner is a very tight hairpin, and the pit lane peels off the hairpin.
Yeah.
And I watched this guy in front of me turn into the corner, understeer, miss the apex, miss the corner entirely, and just go into the pit lane. And
almost as if he planned it.
Almost as if he planned it. And I remember I was laughing my head off, and I looked to my right as I went past him, and I just saw him looking around going, What happened? I'm in the pit lane. It was fantastic.
Superb.
Yeah, superb. Very, very funny.
We should probably talk about what the car was like, though.
No one cares.
Well, I do. I thought it was a bit of a retrograde step. Not in terms of power or speed or anything, but if you think of all the things that happened to the 911 with that generation, they kind of all play a bit towards the turbos, luxury, quiet, refinement, the electric steering and the considerable extension in the wheelbase, which very much favoured, stability over agility. But to me, it made the turbo. We know it's never been the most involving of 911s, but it just went a bit too far with this one.
Yeah, it did.
It really was an express. It was a transcontinental device. There really wasn't that much joy in driving it. Not enough, to me, to really stand up for what we've always wanted all 911s to be, which whatever else they do, they should just be great driving machines. And even the earlier turbos, although, the really early ones were really flawed, and the 993s and 996s and 997s weren't as exciting as some of the naturally aspirated cars. They were still great cars to drive. And this was just it was a blunt instrument.
It was, it was. Yeah. No, I remember thinking exactly that on that Bilsterberg launch, and we drove them on the road extensively as well. And I just remember thinking, okay, this thing is sensationally quick. Later on found out just how quick it remains in bad weather. That's a typical 911 turbo thing.
Unbelievable.
But you're not that engaged with the process of making it go fast. The car does the work for you.
Yeah.
And I wrote that in my review. And the thing about this 911 Turbo in particular is that there's a lot of nuance here. And I later drove them in bad conditions, later drove them on other circuits where we weren't doing the ducks and drakes thing. And when it was facelifted a little bit later, I did the launch in Kyalami, South Africa.
Oh,
Another great track.
No, I was on that one.
That's a brilliant circuit.
Yeah.
And I had loads of track time.
They'd only just finished rebuilding it, hadn't they?
Yeah, they had. Yeah, so the place looked amazing.
Yeah.
And we weren't doing the ducks and drakes thing, so we were filming, which meant going backwards and forwards through the same corner lots of times, and doing your best to make it look quite exciting on camera. And the thing about that car is that on track, when you have that space, when you have that license and the time to turn everything off and get it moving around, it does so beautifully.
Yeah.
In the most controllable way. It's so easy to back it into a corner, hoof it, just wind a little bit of steering lock on, but actually come off quite quickly and let the four-wheel drive system do the work.
Yeah.
And you've just got this thing sliding heroically underneath you.
Mm-hmm.
I did the same in the wet at Bedford. There's a video of me out there on YouTube, actually, with this thing just moving around beautifully. And it's not because I'm some hero at the wheel. It's because that car.
It is.
Oh, maybe. But it's because that car. Honestly, anyone could do it. I was astonished by it. It's like, but also when it's moving around like that, it has such soft, fluffy edges. It's not on a knife edge where it's about to spin and bite.
Yeah.
It's super controllable.
Yeah.
And so there is this sort of window within the 911 Turbo, the 991 series, where it is super playful, super fun and exciting. But you cannot do that on the road.
No.
You just can't.
And to be honest, if you were minded to have a 911 that you could drive on track,
that's right.
The Turbo S is the last 911 in the world you want to buy.
Yeah.
And on the road, it just felt a bit mute, a bit distant,
absolutely.
a bit removed, a bit. Just sit back and watch, okay? I'm much better than you. I've got this.
I remember thinking it's like a cookie jar that's just out of reach. Like, there are joys and wonders right there, but you just can't get to them.
You can't get to them. Yeah.
So that's the problem with the 991 for me. And actually, I suspect the 992 is much the same.
I think, so the 992, the Turbo S, was the first car I drove post-lockdown.
Yeah, same.
So I had been meant, you probably had been as well, I was meant to have gone to, not that I'm still bitter about this, not that I can blame Porsche, it was entirely COVID's fault. I was meant to go to Laguna Seca to try that car. I ended up driving it in Reading.
Yeah.
I don't suppose anyone's feeling too sorry for me, but but I mean, and it's possible because we were just, weren't we? We were just so bloody relieved to be working again, to be able to earn a bit, and so many other manufacturers, they took so much longer to unlock. But Porsche just said, look, come to Reading. There won't be anyone there. But if you go to security, someone will chuck you a sealed plastic bag with a key in it. And if you go to this park, there will be a 911 in it. And, you know, you can go off and you can drive it. Don't worry, someone has chucked a bomb in it to kill anything that might be in it before you've got in it. Go and drive it, bring it back. Someone will then chuck another bomb into it for the next person. And I can just remember driving, there's a bit of road sort of near Lamborn and...
I know it well,
Yeah, where's the other place it goes through?
Lamborn
Wantage.
Wantage,
around there. Which is, I mean, it's not ideal, but it's, you know, if you want a quiet, reasonably quick home county sort of road to go and exercise cars on, if time is short and you haven't got anywhere else to go, it tends to be where we end up, because more than anything else, actually, because it photographs quite well. And I can remember going around this thing we call the Lamborn Loop. And actually, just thinking to myself, I thought that car, or this car, because it's still the car they make now, was a bit more engaging. I think Porsche had sort of got the message, and I can remember particularly going round a roundabout and just playing with the throttle a bit and just feeling it. It just felt more adjustable, a bit more playful, a bit more accessible. So a bit of a step back. I quite liked it. But I'd still never say it was the best 911 that you could buy.
I agree with you there. It was a bit more interactive than the 991, but actually we're talking fairly marginal gains.
Yeah.
And that was illustrated when we did our recent triple test with the McLaren Artura, with the new Aston Martin Vantage.
Yeah.
And the 911, fine. If a car to live with, great. It's more practical. A car to use through winter, we've discussed that.
Yeah.
But as a recreation, it was blown into the weeds by the other two.
It was. Because actually, it's almost an unfair comparison because Porsche would be the first people to say, that's not what it's for. That's not, you should have taken a GT3, but a GT3 was the wrong car to have for that as well. But, so maybe there isn't a right Porsche to have for that comparison. But yeah, it just felt, I suppose, while the others are, much more bespoke. The problem with the 911 Turbo S for a car costing, these days, £200,000, it doesn't feel like a £200,000 car. No. It feels like a £100,000 car, which has got a lot of extra stuff on it. And if you drive the Vantage, you drive the Artura, that's not what happens. You're not driving the top of a range which starts at half the price. You're driving a car, you're driving essentially both cars, almost entry-level cars. And, they are clearly set up for, maximum driving pleasure. And just that real, I know I've said it before on this podcast, but I can't think of a better phrase, sense of occasion. You just don't get it.
No.
I took a 992, a T to that job and got out the Turbo S, drove the T there, had a great time, manual gearbox, having a hoot, got in the Turbo S, thinking, gosh, that's quite a lot faster. Then got back in the T to go home and thought, thank goodness for that.
There you go. That's the thing, isn't it? It's if what you want is a sports car to have fun in, it isn't. The 911 Turbo never has been the one that we choose.
No.
Never has been, and it isn't now.
But if you want to be somewhere else in a hurry,
it's the one.
It's the one.
So we are running out of time, so we need to wrap this one up. But we can just talk quickly because there is a new 911 Turbo coming.
Yeah.
We don't know anything about it.
No, but can we speculate?
Of course we can speculate.
Excellent.
So you have a theory, don't you?
I have a theory. So we know, because I've driven it, the GTS is the first hybrid 911, and it's not a normal hybrid in that you can't plug in it, and the battery is about the size of a boiled egg. But it is sufficient to remove all turbo lag, produce fantastic low down torque and everything else. And they say, yes, it's so good, we only need a single turbocharger. And I'm thinking, well, where's the 911 Turbo going to go? And for me, I don't know, nobody said this to me, but when you say to Porsche, is the 911 Turbo, the new Turbo S, going to be a twin-turbo version of this car? They sort of look at you, smile a bit and go, we'll have to wait and see. Which I think is Porsche speak for yes. But I might be wrong. So yeah, it's going to have. So how much power has the current Turbo S got?
650 PS, which is 641 brake horsepower.
Yeah, okay. So it's going to have to begin with a 7.
It's going to be a 7, yeah.
Yeah.
And it will be still PDK, still four-wheel drive. It'll have all the technology on it. It's going to be phenomenally quick.
Phenomenally quick.
No question about that.
Yeah, it'll be a bit heavier because it'll have all the hybrid stuff on it.
Yeah.
So yes, is it going to be sharper though? Is it going to be more interactive? History would tell us that, logically speaking, it probably won't be, because it will have more power and it will have more weight. Porsche are not going to suddenly go, it's only got 500 horsepower, but we've taken 200 kilos out of it, because it's not that kind of car.
It's not that car, no.
But at the same time, technology progresses, they get cleverer and cleverer at this stuff, so maybe this will be the car where they find the way, particularly using the hybrid, of making it more interactive, of giving it more of what you want, while at the same time not taking away any of that, daily driving, ride and refinement, point-to-point speed thing that, people who buy those sorts of cars feel that they need.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. We'll
see fairly soon. So that's the 911 Turbo. There's no question it's an icon. In and of itself, it is an icon.
Because it's such an important car in the history of sports cars.
Yeah, it is.
So, the fact it's a 911 aside, the fact it's the first successful turbocharged car absolutely qualifies it. Yeah.
But
it's far more interesting talking about this rather flawed kind of car than just doing a sort of normal 911 one and going, oh yeah, they're just brilliant.
They're wonderful. Yeah. So there we go. It's an icon, but it's not the one we would have.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll leave that one there. But before we disappear, I'm just going to remind you all that podcast listeners can get a 15% discount on a subscription to the Intercooler.
Yeah.
Use POD15 at checkout. It supports the podcast. It's the best way to do that. But you also get full and unlimited access to our ad-free, multi-award-winning car magazine. So It's a win-win for everyone, I think.
It certainly is.
And you do that, please. And in return, we'll do another podcast next week.
Look forward to it. Bye.